When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from the dread that he would see those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I tried to snatch the phone away from him, but he expertly pulled it back and continued reading. I watched his face change as he read each line, feeling my life shattering in those few seconds. Yes, right now, he would find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he turned to the next page, and I knew this was the moment he would reach the message that would ruin everything. The one single message that would explain it all and put an end to this. Or perhaps, it would make everything even more tangled. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I watched his face pale as he read the sender's name. He froze. Not even blinking. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I had when I was nervous. My nerves mingled with the sheer terror of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from 2 meters away. This was exactly what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. The one mistake that changed everything. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all started, before I share the secret I've been hiding for so long. It's strange how a moment can feel like a lifetime, and yet, the beginning of something unexpected is never clear until the very end. I had been married for over 25 years, and if you had asked me about my life a year ago, I would have said everything was perfectly fine. A comfortable life. A predictable one. My husband, Daniel, worked hard in his career, traveling often for business. And I stayed home. I filled my days with the usual routine, housework, grocery shopping, occasional meetups with friends. Nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. The kind of life I thought I wanted. But somewhere in the quiet of our house, in the absence of his presence, I began to feel something I hadn't expected, an emptiness that started to gnaw at me. The silence between us, even when he was home, grew louder. He was there, but he wasn't truly there. Our conversations were routine. Casual. His long business trips meant he was away more often than not, and when he did return, it was only for a few days, during which he was tired, preoccupied, and never really present. I started to wonder if this was all there was to life. The truth was, I was lonely. Not just lonely in a physical sense, but lonely in a deeper, more unsettling way. I had started to feel invisible. The years had passed, and I could see it in my reflection, my hair graying, the lines on my face deepening, the softening of my body. I wasn't the woman he had married. I wasn't the woman I had once been. And I began to ask myself, was this it? Was this what I had to look forward to for the rest of my life? That's when I first met Richard. He wasn't supposed to matter. He was just my husband's father. A man I'd known for years, but someone who had always been in the background. A distant figure in the periphery of our family life. But that night, when I saw him at dinner, there was something different about him. Something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the way he smiled, or the way his eyes sparkled with life. Or maybe it was just that, for the first time in a long while, he seemed to truly see me. Not as someone's wife or someone's daughter-in-law, but as a woman. At first, I told myself it was nothing. He was just being friendly, kind. But there was something in the way he looked at me that made my heart race, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anything inappropriate, not yet. But it was enough to awaken something in me. A longing I hadn't even known was there. I thought about it the next day, as I went about my daily tasks. My husband had left for another business trip, as usual. I tried to shake the thought of Richard from my mind, but it lingered. It was strange. I wasn't attracted to him in the way you might think. But he reminded me of something I had lost. something I wanted to rediscover. I couldn't explain it. I had no reason to feel this way. But somehow, the idea of him, the thought of someone seeing me again, truly seeing me, was enough to stir a feeling of warmth inside me, something that felt dangerously close to desire. I tried to ignore it, to push it away. After all, he was my husband's father. It was absurd to even think about it. But the more I tried to forget, the more I found myself drawn to him. He called one afternoon, asking if I could stop by to help with some paperwork. I agreed, telling myself it was just a friendly visit, nothing more. When I arrived at his house, he was standing in the kitchen, making coffee. The familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a moment, I was struck by how domestic it felt. How simple. How real. "Thanks for coming," he said, offering me a cup. His smile was warm, his eyes lingering on mine a little longer than they should have. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my heart was racing. I hadn't realized how much I missed being noticed, being seen. As we sat down at the kitchen table, he asked about my life. Not just the surface-level things, but the deeper questions. He seemed genuinely interested in how I was doing. And it was in that moment that I realized how desperately I craved someone to care, to ask, to listen. "Tell me," Richard said, his voice low and thoughtful, "how are you really doing?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. But something about his gentle tone, his unwavering attention, made me want to confide in him. "I don't know," I said softly, "I guess I'm just going through the motions. It feels like nothing ever changes." He nodded, understanding. "I get that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes, we just get stuck in a routine, and we forget what it's like to feel alive." I wasn't sure what made me do it, but before I knew it, I was telling him about how I felt invisible. How I missed the person I once was. How the years had worn me down, and how I feared I was losing myself. And as I spoke, I noticed him watching me closely, his eyes softening with empathy. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. But in that moment, something shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was seen. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Later that evening, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside me had awakened, and it was terrifying. I wasn't sure what it meant, or where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. Something had shifted, and there was no unseeing it. And so, here I am, standing at the edge of something I never expected. Something that will change everything. The next few days passed by like a blur, the ordinary rhythm of my life suddenly feeling foreign, as if I was walking through someone else's day-to-day existence. The mornings were no longer just about the simple task of getting out of bed, making coffee, and starting the chores. Instead, my mind was caught somewhere between the need to maintain normalcy and the growing awareness of a shift within me. Something had awakened, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The phone call from Richard had seemed innocent enough at first. He had asked if I could stop by to help him with some papers. It was routine, something that had happened many times before. But after that day, nothing felt routine anymore. When I walked into his house, I realized just how much I had underestimated the impact of that one simple invitation. It wasn't about the task at hand, papers, files, anything, no, it was about something else. Something unspoken between us. A kind of quiet tension I hadn't been prepared for. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking things. Richard was just being kind, showing a little interest in me, but that was all. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that I was lying to myself. I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The spark. The connection. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It felt real. The following week, when Daniel left for another of his business trips, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't because I didn't want him to be home, I did, in a way, but it was easier to breathe when I wasn't constantly measuring myself against his expectations, when I wasn't caught in the slow suffocating pressure of pretending that everything was fine. In his absence, I could at least feel like I had some space to figure out what was going on with me. What had changed? I found myself thinking about Richard more often than I should have. It wasn't a conscious decision. His face, his voice, the way he had looked at me that afternoon, it stayed with me. At times, I felt embarrassed by how easily I had been affected, how easily I had allowed myself to be pulled into something I hadn't even understood. But there it was, that quiet ache, that longing that had been hidden beneath layers of years spent in a marriage that was no longer what it had once been. The phone call came again, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I agreed to meet him, to help him with something else. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just another ordinary errand. But as I stood in front of the mirror that morning, choosing what to wear, I noticed how carefully I was picking out my clothes, how I was looking for something to wear that would make me feel, well, seen. I told myself it was nothing, just the need to be presentable, but I knew it was more than that. I wanted to look good. I wanted him to notice. When I arrived at his house, I felt a sense of anticipation in the pit of my stomach, something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't excitement. It was a quiet, steady pull. When Richard greeted me at the door, he seemed pleased to see me, his expression warm and inviting. "Thanks for coming by again," he said, his tone casual, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart beat faster. I smiled and nodded. "Of course. What's on the agenda today?" He led me into the living room, where a few files lay scattered on the table. But as I sat down to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real task at hand wasn't about paperwork. It was about something more, something I wasn't ready to face yet. We talked as we worked. It wasn't anything deep, just casual conversation. But I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on me every now and then, the way he seemed to be listening so intently, like he was searching for something in me. It made me feel exposed, though I couldn't explain why. It was a strange feeling, one that both frightened and intrigued me. After a while, we took a break. Richard made us some tea, and we sat together on the couch. There was a distance between us, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like a delicate balance, something fragile, like the air was charged with an energy I couldn't control. I felt like I was on the edge of something I didn't fully understand, and yet I didn't want to move away from it. "Tell me something," Richard said suddenly, his voice low and thoughtful. "What is it that you're looking for?" I froze, unsure of how to answer. I wasn't expecting him to ask such a direct question, and I didn't know if I even had an answer. I could feel my pulse quickening as I searched for the right words. "I don't know," I finally said, feeling vulnerable. I guess I'm just trying to find something that feels real again." Richard didn't respond right away. He just looked at me for a long moment, as though weighing my words. Then, he said softly, "I think I understand." There was a pause between us, a quiet that filled the space. My heart was beating faster now, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I wasn't sure what to say next, and for a moment, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without warning, Richard leaned forward, his hand brushing mine. The touch was soft, but it sent a jolt through me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw something that made me want to look away. Something dangerous. Something that could change everything. I didn't pull my hand away. I couldn't. Instead, I let my fingers linger, just for a second longer than necessary. And in that moment, I felt something stir deep within me. It was like waking up from a long, numb sleep. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was as though Richard had seen something in me that I had forgotten about myself. "We should get back to work," I said quickly, breaking the tension, but my voice sounded distant, as though it wasn't really mine. Richard didn't pull away either. He just nodded slowly, as though understanding something unspoken. For the rest of the afternoon, we worked in silence, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was an undercurrent of something I couldn't deny anymore. As I left that evening, I tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in my chest. But it wasn't easy. I felt restless, uncertain. When I got into my car, I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, wondering what had just happened. What was this? And why did it feel so important? I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew that everything had just changed. The question was, what was I going to do about it? And that was the question I carried with me as I drove home. The days that followed seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite explain. Every morning, I woke up with the same sense of uncertainty pressing on my chest. It was as though I was living in two worlds at once. There was the world where I was simply a wife, quietly going through the motions of my life, and then there was the world where I felt something else stir inside me. A world that felt dangerous, unfamiliar, and yet compelling. I told myself that I was just overthinking things. Richard was my father-in-law. Nothing more. It was just a moment, a brief touch, a fleeting conversation. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, it did. I could feel it every time I thought about him. The memory of his hand brushing mine, his gaze lingering on me for just a second too long, it all weighed heavily on me. Daniel had been away for over a week, and with each passing day, I found myself sinking deeper into this strange place I hadn't expected to be. I missed him, in a way. But I didn't miss him the way I should have. I missed the idea of him, the man he had once been. I missed the way we used to talk, the way we used to laugh together. But those moments felt so distant now, buried under the quiet tension that had grown between us. There were times when I wondered if I was doing something wrong. After all, what had happened with Richard wasn't just a matter of physical attraction. It was something deeper. Something that came from a place I hadn't acknowledged in years. I had started to question everything about my life, my marriage, my choices, and the person I had become. I tried to push those thoughts aside, but it was like trying to ignore the elephant in the room. Every time I looked at Daniel, I saw the man he was, and then I saw the man I wanted him to be. I wanted him to see me, to really see me. But every time I tried to reach for that connection, I felt like I was reaching for something out of my grasp. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. I picked it up absent-mindedly, expecting another work email or a text from one of my friends. But when I saw Richard's name on the screen, my stomach did a little flip. I hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon. The message was short, but it made my heart race. "Can you come over tomorrow? There's something I need to talk to you about." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I stared at the screen, unsure of what to make of it. What could he possibly need to talk to me about? Had something happened? Was he going to say something that would change everything? I wasn't sure how long I sat there, my fingers frozen on the phone. Eventually, I forced myself to respond. "Sure. I'll be there in the afternoon." The message sent, but my heart hadn't stopped pounding. The weight of it settled on me like a heavy blanket, and for the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something I couldn't control. The next day, I found myself driving to Richard's house with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. I couldn't help but wonder what he wanted to talk about. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them particularly pleasant. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that maybe he just needed help with something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the papers or the errands. There was something more. When I arrived, Richard was waiting for me at the door, just as he had been the last time. But today, there was something different in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. It was almost as though he was waiting for me, not just as his daughter-in-law, but as something else. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "What's going on? You said you wanted to talk." He stepped aside to let me in, his expression serious. "Come in," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." I followed him into the living room, where the air felt thick, charged. He didn't immediately sit down. Instead, he paced for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I know this is going to sound strange," he said, turning to face me. "But I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. About what you said, about not feeling seen. I get it. I've been there, too. And I think I can help you." I blinked, not sure where he was going with this. "Help me with what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "I've been thinking about this for a while, but it wasn't until you said that it really hit me. I think you need someone who sees you. Who notices you. Who really sees you, not just as a wife or a mother, but as a woman." I felt my heart skip a beat. His words, though they weren't overt, sounded like something more than just casual advice. They sounded like understanding. "I've been married a long time," he continued, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "And I know what it's like to feel invisible. I don't want that for you. I don't want you to feel like you've been forgotten. Like you're just going through the motions. You deserve more than that." His words hung in the air, and I felt something stir inside me. It was as though he had somehow reached into the depths of me and pulled out something I had buried long ago. The part of me that still wanted to feel desired, wanted to feel alive. But I couldn't respond. I couldn't even breathe for a moment. Everything inside me screamed for me to walk away, to end this before it went too far. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the pull. The pull that had been growing stronger with each passing day. I looked at Richard, and for the first time, I saw him in a way I hadn't before. He wasn't just my husband's father. He wasn't just the man who had been a part of my life for so many years. He was something more, something complicated, something that I wasn't sure how to handle. "I don't know what you're suggesting," I finally said, my voice shaky. "But I don't think this is a good idea." Richard's gaze softened, but his expression didn't change. He stepped closer, closing the space between us. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said quietly. "I'm just telling you that I understand. And that I don't want you to feel alone in this." The air between us felt thick with tension, and for a moment, I couldn't move. His words had an effect on me that I hadn't expected. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, feeling a mixture of fear and something else, something that I couldn't name. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. Richard stepped back, his expression softening. "I think you should go home now," he said, his voice calm, almost distant. "We both need some time to think about what's been said." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I turned and walked toward the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know what any of this meant. But one thing was clear, something had changed. And I couldn't go back. As I drove home, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my thoughts were a whirlwind. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with all of this. What was I supposed to feel? What was I supposed to think? I knew one thing for sure, my life was about to change, whether I was ready for it or not. I spent the next few days in a haze, a kind of fog that settled over everything I did. The routine I had once relied on now felt suffocating. My mind constantly circled back to that moment with Richard. His words. His proximity. The weight of it all lingered like a shadow in my life, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. Each time I tried to focus on something else, housework, shopping, even reading, I found my mind drifting back to the conversation we had shared. I had tried to convince myself that it meant nothing. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. There was an undeniable connection that had formed, one that went beyond mere words or gestures. It was something deeper, something that neither of us had expected. I tried to dismiss it. I tried to tell myself that it was just a moment of weakness, that I was simply craving attention, craving something I hadn't realized I had lost in my marriage. But the more I told myself this, the less I believed it. The truth was, it wasn't just about attention. It was about something far more profound. Something that, if I allowed myself to confront it, could change everything. Daniel had been gone for a few more days. The silence in our home was almost deafening. I wandered through the empty rooms, feeling more isolated with every step. It wasn't that I missed him exactly, but rather, I missed the idea of him, the person he used to be. There had been a time when our conversations had flowed easily, when we had shared moments of connection that didn't require words. But now, everything had changed. We had become strangers to each other, living in the same house, but existing in completely separate worlds. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if I had missed my chance to feel truly alive? What if this emptiness, this restlessness, was something I couldn't fix by just trying harder in my marriage? What if the person I was seeking wasn't even someone I could find in my husband, but in someone else? Someone who could see me the way I had longed to be seen. The phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Richard had texted. My heart skipped a beat as I picked up the phone. There was only a single line, "Can we talk tomorrow? I have something to say." I stared at the message for a long time, my mind racing. What did he want now? I told myself it was nothing. Just a follow-up to our last conversation. But I couldn't deny the unease that crept up my spine. I had already crossed a line by engaging with him this much. And now, here he was again, pulling me back into a space I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. I wanted to respond. I wanted to tell him that we needed to stop, that I couldn't handle this anymore. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I typed back, "Sure, I'll come by tomorrow afternoon." When I hit send, I immediately regretted it. I had agreed to something I didn't fully understand, and I had no idea where it would lead. But there was a pull, a gravitational force that kept drawing me back. It was like I had stepped into an unknown world, and I wasn't sure how to find my way out. The next day, I drove to Richard's house once again. The drive was quieter this time, the weight of the situation heavier on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. When I arrived, Richard greeted me with the same calm smile, but there was an edge to it now, something more serious. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice a little lower than usual. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I nodded, my stomach tightening. "What's going on?" He stepped aside to let me in, his gaze holding mine for just a moment too long. I couldn't look away. I wasn't sure if it was the tension in the room, or something else, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We sat down in the living room again, this time with a palpable distance between us. Richard wasn't pacing now. He was still, almost too still, and I could feel the gravity of his words before he even spoke them. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice thoughtful. "About feeling unseen. About how you've been lost in your own life, in your own marriage. And I can't just stand by and pretend that it's okay. I know you're in a difficult place, and I think I can help. I froze, not knowing how to respond. What did he mean by that? What help could he possibly offer? I know it's not easy, Richard continued. I know how much you've been holding in. But sometimes, we need someone to remind us of who we really are, of what we're capable of. Someone who sees the person beneath all the roles we play. I stared at him, my mind reeling. This wasn't the casual conversation I had expected. It wasn't just about the papers or helping him out with something. No, this was something else entirely. Something far more personal, far more dangerous. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? How could you possibly help? Richard looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as though he was trying to decide how much to say. I know you're feeling trapped, he said quietly. I know how it feels to be stuck in a life that isn't really yours anymore. I've been there. And I think you're looking for something more than just a distraction, more than just a moment of escape. You're looking for a way to feel alive again. To feel seen. And I think I can help you do that. I wanted to pull away, to reject what he was saying. But the truth was, his words resonated with something deep inside me. He was right. I had been looking for something. I had been longing for something I didn't even know how to name. And here he was, offering me a way out, a way to feel that spark of life again. I stood up, pacing around the room, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't supposed to be happening. This wasn't what I had signed up for. I had come here to help, to be the good wife, the daughter-in-law. But now I didn't know what I was doing. I can't, I said finally, turning to face him. I don't know what you're suggesting, but I can't. I can't let this go any further. Richard didn't move. He didn't argue. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. I'm not suggesting anything, he said softly. I'm just saying that you don't have to go through this alone. You don't have to hide from what you really want. The words hung in the air between us, thick with tension. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to escape this situation before it went any further. But another part of me was drawn to him, to his words, to the idea that someone, anyone, could see me for who I truly was. And just like that, I realized something that scared me more than anything else. I didn't know how to stop. I turned away, my heart racing. I need to go, I said, my voice tight. I'll figure this out. But I can't do this right now. Richard didn't stop me. He didn't try to convince me to stay. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on me as I walked to the door. As I stepped outside, the weight of the situation settled on me like a heavy cloak. I had crossed a line, and I didn't know if I could ever go back. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure, everything had just changed. And now, I had to figure out what I was going to do about it. The days that followed felt like walking across a frozen lake, each step cautious and tentative, unsure whether the ice beneath would hold or shatter. I was no longer certain of the boundaries I had once trusted, what was right, what was wrong, what was safe. I moved through my life like someone wearing a mask, performing the expected tasks of a wife, a mother, a daughter-in-law, all while hiding the rising storm of uncertainty within me. Daniel had returned home for a few days between business trips. His presence in the house didn't feel like comfort, it felt like an interruption. I hated myself for that thought, but I couldn't deny it. Everything about him, his routine, his silence, his endless preoccupation with work, only reminded me of how far apart we had drifted. We sat across from each other at dinner, and though our conversation skimmed the surface of everyday life, I felt a canyon widening between us. He asked if the house had been quiet while he was gone, and I nodded. I didn't tell him about the way I stared at the ceiling most nights, feeling both restless and numb. I didn't tell him that I had spent more time in my car than inside the house, driving around with no destination, just to avoid the silence. I didn't tell him that Richard had reached out again. That morning, while Daniel was still asleep, I stood in front of my closet for a long time, running my fingers along the fabric of my dresses. I wasn't choosing an outfit, I was avoiding my reflection. I didn't want to see the conflict in my own eyes. Eventually, I settled on something simple. It wasn't about fashion today. It was about shielding myself with something neutral, something safe. But it still mattered. It always did, now. I had told Richard the first would stop by to return a book he had lent me. It was an excuse, of course. The book sat unread on my nightstand. But it gave me a reason to see him again. I didn't let myself overthink it. I told myself I would drop it off quickly and leave. No lingering. No more moments. But as I pulled into his driveway, my pulse betrayed me. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to regulate my breathing. His house looked the same, quiet, calm, modest. But everything about this visit felt different. He opened the door before I even knocked, as if he'd been watching for me. There was no smile, just a calm nod of acknowledgement. Inside, the air felt still, like the pause before a storm. I handed him the book, making sure to keep my eyes on the cover instead of his face. He thanked me and gestured toward the kitchen. I just made tea. Would you like to stay for a cup? I should have said no. I should have made an excuse and walked away. But my body moved before my mind could stop it. I followed him into the kitchen, taking a seat at the small table by the window. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtain, casting long, gentle shadows across the room. We talked for a while, cautiously, as though nothing unspoken hovered between us. But it did. Every word, every glance, was layered with the weight of what we were trying not to say. I noticed the small details, how his hands moved when he spoke, how he never quite looked directly at me for too long, how he seemed to choose his words with great care. At one point, there was a moment of quiet between us. Not uncomfortable, just still. I reached for my cup, and our hands brushed. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't dramatic. But it happened. I froze. So did he. I looked up, and our eyes met. We kissed. It wasn't planned, it wasn't discussed, and it wasn't rational. But it happened. A soft, fleeting moment that lasted longer in memory than it did in time. When it was over, I sat back in my chair, heart racing, hands trembling slightly. He looked down at the table, silent. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, and in that pause, I realized how fragile everything had become. I stood up slowly, needing to move, to break the silence before it crushed me. I should go, I said, my voice low but steady. He didn't stop me. He only nodded. As I reached for the door, I paused for a second, waiting for something, an apology, a question, a reason. But there was nothing. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. The cool air hit my skin like a wave. I walked quickly to my car, not looking back, not thinking. I drove in silence, the road ahead a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I didn't loosen them. I didn't want to feel anything but the wheel in my hands. When I got home, Daniel was in the living room, reviewing notes on his laptop. He barely glanced up when I entered, offering a casual hey before returning to his screen. I walked past him without responding, heading straight to the bathroom where I locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub. I stared at the tile floor, breathing slowly, trying to understand what had just happened. My reflection in the mirror across the room looked back at me, same face, same eyes, but not the same woman. Not anymore. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where this was going. But I knew that the line I had once promised never to cross was now behind me. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. Later that evening, I moved through the house with deliberate calm, setting the table, preparing dinner, folding laundry. I needed the routine. I needed the illusion of control. Daniel joined me at the table, distracted and tired. He asked about my day, and I answered in half-truths. He didn't notice the difference in my tone, or the way I avoided his eyes. He didn't ask if something was wrong. And maybe that hurt more than anything else. Because despite everything I had done, despite everything I had felt, part of me had still wanted him to see me. To ask. To care. But he didn't. And maybe that was the clearest sign of all, that somewhere, quietly, without either of us realizing it, we had both stopped reaching for each other. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Daniel turned away from me in his sleep, just as he always did. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing, steady and unaware. And I wondered how long I could keep pretending that nothing had changed. I knew it wouldn't stay hidden forever. Things like this never do. The house was unusually quiet the next morning, not in a peaceful way, but in the way that makes you notice the ticking of a clock or the distant hum of a refrigerator. Everything felt louder in that silence, my own breath, the soft scuff of my slippers on the hardwood floor, the quiet rustle of fabric as I folded laundry no one had asked to be done. I moved slowly through the rooms, uncertain of myself, uncertain of everything. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be seen or to disappear. Daniel had left early for a meeting out of town. He hadn't noticed that I'd barely slept. He hadn't noticed how my hands shook when I poured his coffee. He hadn't noticed anything at all. Or maybe he had and chose not to mention it. Either possibility hurt in its own way. I sat at the kitchen table after he left, staring at a piece of toast I had no intention of eating. I wasn't hungry. I was unsettled. The memory of yesterday kept replaying in my mind in fragments, his face, the way the sunlight had hit the side of the kitchen wall, the exact moment when our hands met and the pause that followed. And then that brief, irreversible moment, we kissed. I hadn't allowed myself to think too deeply about what it meant. Not yet. I was afraid to. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. I kept telling myself I needed clarity, but all I seemed to gather was more confusion. I was standing in the middle of my life, and suddenly nothing felt familiar. I didn't recognize the person I was becoming, but I couldn't stop her either. She moved differently. She noticed things. She felt things more sharply, more vividly. And I wasn't sure whether that was liberation or destruction. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was calm, distant, almost mechanical. He told me that the following weekend, he wanted to take a break from work and suggested we spend a few days away, just the two of us. It was so out of character that I didn't know what to say at first. I agreed, of course. I always did. But the weight of it hung in my chest long after I hung up. I stood at the sink, washing the same glass over and over again. Maybe this trip was his way of reconnecting. Maybe he felt the distance too. Maybe, without knowing why, he was trying to fix something. And if that was the case, what did that make me? A coward for hiding what had happened? A hypocrite for pretending I still belonged fully to this marriage? Then the second blow came. An hour later, Richard called. He rarely used the phone. Most of our recent communication had been brief, surface-level texts. But today, his voice was steady and clear. He asked if I had time to talk. And before I could decide whether to say yes or no, I heard myself agreeing. He didn't want to meet at his house this time. Instead, he suggested a walk through the park near the edge of town, the one with the old oak trees and winding paths that rarely drew crowds. The suggestion alone felt like a shift. As if both of us knew we couldn't risk the closeness of walls or rooms or doors anymore. I arrived early, the wind brushing lightly against my coat as I waited near the iron bench beneath the largest tree. It was a place we'd never been together before, which somehow made it feel safer. Detached. But that sense of safety faded the moment I saw him walking toward me, his hands in his pockets, his face quiet and unreadable. We didn't greet each other. Not really. We simply fell into step along the gravel path, our pace slow, like neither of us knew where we were going. He spoke first, his voice low. "Daniel mentioned the trip?" I nodded. "He called this morning." "I didn't expect that from him," he said. "But maybe it's a good thing." "Is it?" I asked, not entirely sure what I meant. He glanced at me, then looked away again. "It's complicated." That was an understatement, but I didn't correct him. Everything about this situation was complicated, and the more we danced around it, the harder it became to deny. We walked in silence for a while after that. The leaves rustled overhead, the path crunching beneath our feet. I kept thinking that maybe, if we just kept walking, we could delay the inevitable conversation, the one we both knew was coming. But eventually, we reached the edge of the path, where the trees opened to a wide field and a view of the hills beyond. He stopped there, turned to me, and finally said what we were both thinking. "We can't keep doing this." I didn't respond. I didn't have the words. "This, whatever it is between us, it's not fair to him," he continued. "And it's not fair to you either." I looked away, my eyes stinging with something I didn't want to name. "I know," I whispered. But knowing didn't make it any easier. Knowing didn't erase the moment we had shared or the way it had made me feel. "I never wanted this," he said, almost to himself. "Not with you. Especially not you." That hurt more than it should have. But I understood what he meant. The guilt wasn't one-sided. It lived in both of us. In every glance, every pause, every unspoken word. He turned to face the open sky, the wind tugging at his collar. "He's my son." I nodded, the ache in my chest growing. "And he's my husband." We stood like that for a while, side by side, two people trying to make sense of something that couldn't be undone. Eventually, we turned back, retracing our steps along the same path, but nothing felt the same. Every step felt heavier. Every silence felt louder. There was no longer any question of what had happened. There was only the weight of what came next. When we reached the parking lot, we paused beside our cars, neither of us ready to say goodbye. But there was nothing else to say. He opened his door and paused. "Take the trip," he said quietly. "Maybe it'll give you clarity." I nodded, unable to speak. Then I watched as he drove away, his car disappearing around the curve of the road. As I sat in my own car, hands resting on the steering wheel, I felt the strange mix of grief and relief settle in my chest. Something had ended, though I wasn't entirely sure what. Maybe it was just the illusion that I could keep living two separate lives without consequence. Maybe it was the first step toward owning the truth of what I had done. Either way, I knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it. Whatever came next, I would no longer hide from it. I started the engine, the soft hum filling the silence. And I drove home. The days leading up to the trip felt like a slow, unavoidable march towards something I wasn't sure I was ready for. Daniel had booked a small cabin by a lake, a place we had visited a few years ago, before everything started to feel stale. It had been a time when we still talked, when we still cared enough to share our thoughts and dreams with each other. I almost convinced myself that this trip could be the reset we needed, the opportunity to rekindle something. But deep down, I knew it was just a moment in time, a fleeting attempt to fix something that had already broken. The cabin was just as I remembered, quiet, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by the stillness of nature. The sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional ripple of water from the lake just beyond the porch. It was the kind of place that made you believe in peace, in slowing down, in escaping the noise of the world. But as I stood there, watching Daniel unpack the car, I realized that no amount of nature could fix the silence that had settled between us. The silence that had become so loud I could barely hear myself think. We didn't talk much on the drive up. Daniel was preoccupied with his thoughts, and I, with mine. I kept replaying the conversation with Richard in my head, his words, his gaze, the way he had said it wasn't fair to either of us. How could I have let it go this far? What had happened to me? What had happened to us? When we finally settled into the cabin, I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to pretend that nothing had changed. Everything felt so much harder now. The familiar spaces, the old comforts, the shared memories, all of it had become a reminder of everything we had lost. Daniel suggested we go for a walk after dinner. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the lake, and the air was crisp, cooling with the approach of evening. We walked along the shore in silence, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath. "I'm glad we came here," Daniel said eventually, his voice low. "It's been a while since we've had a chance to just get away." I nodded, but the words felt empty. I wanted to say something real, something that could bridge the gap between us, but nothing came. What could I say? How could I explain the mess I had created? We stopped at a bench overlooking the water. Daniel sat first, and I followed, sitting beside him, but not too close. I could feel the space between us, as wide as the lake in front of us. "I've been thinking a lot about things lately," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on the water. "About us." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to be honest, but I was too scared of the consequences. What if the truth ruined everything? What if it was already too late? "You know, when we first got married," Daniel continued, his voice almost a whisper, "I never thought we'd be in this place. I thought it would always be easy. I thought it would always be us." I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't how I wanted things to go. I didn't want to be the one to break him. I didn't want to be the one to admit that I had failed, that I had made a mistake that could never be undone. "I never thought we'd be here either," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we are." Daniel turned to look at me then, his expression soft but filled with an intensity one couldn't place. "I don't know what happened," he said quietly. "I don't know where we lost each other. But I want to find it again. I want us to be okay." I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know if I could be what he wanted me to be anymore. I didn't know if I could pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. But at the same time, I didn't know if I was ready to let go. I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth. "I don't know if we can," I said finally. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were." The words hung in the air between us, unspoken, heavy. I could feel the weight of them in my chest, but I couldn't take them back. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened, that everything was still the same. We sat in silence for a while longer, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees and the distant calls of birds. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm, golden light across the water, but the warmth didn't reach me. I felt cold, detached, like I was watching everything unfold from a distance. "I don't want to lose you," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "I don't want to lose you either," I replied softly. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could stay. I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending that everything was okay when I knew it wasn't. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, and when we returned, Daniel began to prepare dinner. I helped, but it felt mechanical, like we were just going through the motions. The house felt too small, the space between us too wide. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest. Every part of me was screaming to just say the words, to tell him the truth, to get it over with, to stop pretending. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wasn't ready for what might come after. We ate in silence, and after dinner, Daniel suggested we sit on the porch for a while, to watch the stars. I agreed, but I wasn't really there. My mind kept drifting back to Richard. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape him. I had made a mistake, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if I even wanted to. I didn't know if I wanted to fix anything at all. Because every time I tried to look at my life, I saw only fragments, pieces that didn't fit together anymore. The woman I was before was gone. The wife I used to be was slipping away, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. We sat on the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Daniel's hand brushed mine briefly, but I pulled away quickly, the touch feeling too intimate, too familiar. I couldn't handle it. Not now. Not after everything. I'm tired, I said, standing up abruptly. I think I'm going to go to bed. Daniel didn't say anything. He just nodded, watching me as I walked back inside. When I reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the empty space beside me. I had no idea what to do next. I had no idea what I was supposed to feel. All I knew was that I was lost, lost in a life that no longer fit, lost in a marriage that had been defined by silence and distance for too long. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew that no matter what I did next, there was no going back. The morning after the tense dinner in the cabin was no different from the ones that had preceded it. I woke up early, as I always did, but today there was something distinctly different about the quiet. Daniel was still asleep beside me, his deep breaths calm, unaware of the turmoil that churned inside me. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, replaying everything that had led me here. The trip to the lake, the conversations with Richard, the lingering touch, the kiss that had changed everything, even if I didn't want to admit it. I got out of bed as silently as possible, not wanting to wake Daniel. He needed rest, and in truth, so did I. But how could I rest when I had created a storm that was only just beginning to rage? There was no pretending anymore, no hiding from what I had done. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. But I also couldn't bring myself to confront it head-on. I wasn't ready for that yet. I wandered through the house, moving without any clear purpose. I went to the kitchen, brewed coffee, then poured myself a cup. I sipped it slowly, staring out the window at the fog rolling over the lake. The view was beautiful, peaceful in its own way, but it felt distant now. Nothing felt familiar anymore. I felt like a stranger in my own life. The phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text message from Richard. My heart skipped a beat. I had half expected to hear from him, though I didn't know what I would say if he reached out. The message was short, just a single line, "Can we talk today? It's important." The words sent a chill through me. I wasn't sure I was ready for another conversation with him, not yet. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend I wasn't curious about what he wanted to say. I stood there for a long moment, holding the phone in my hand, uncertain whether I should reply or not. I put the phone down, walked to the window, and stared out at the misty lake. The stillness of the water only reminded me of the storm inside me. How long could I keep this up? How long could I hide from the truth? I didn't know, but I had to face it eventually. Maybe this conversation with Richard would be the beginning of that. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and typed a response, "Okay. I'll meet you." I knew it was a mistake. I knew I wasn't ready, but I couldn't stop myself from agreeing. This was the moment I had been avoiding, and I couldn't hide from it any longer. I sent the message, then sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling slightly, but I didn't know if it was from fear or something else, something deeper, more unsettling. Daniel stirred in the bedroom, but I didn't move. I didn't want to disturb him. It was as if I were waiting for the world to shift beneath me, for everything to come crashing down. Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe there was no way to stop what was coming. But the question remained, what would I do once it all fell apart? I didn't know. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I prepared breakfast for Daniel, but every action felt distant, like I was on autopilot. When he finally joined me at the table, he seemed unaware of the turmoil inside me. He smiled, asked about the coffee, and made small talk about the weather. But I couldn't focus on his words. I couldn't focus on anything other than the message waiting for me on my phone. It was as if everything had changed overnight. The calm of the cabin, the peacefulness of the lake, all of it felt like a distant memory now. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and I didn't know how to go back. We ate breakfast in silence, neither of us saying much. I could feel the tension rising, but neither of us acknowledged it. It was as though we were both afraid to speak the truth aloud, afraid to bring the unspoken between us into the light. After breakfast, Daniel suggested we go for a walk around the lake. It seemed like a normal request, but the weight of it felt suffocating. How could I walk beside him, pretending everything was fine, when everything was falling apart inside me? How could I be here with him, when my thoughts were consumed with Richard? I agreed though, because what else could I do? I couldn't stay in the cabin, not with all the emotions swirling around me. We walked slowly along the water's edge, the mist rising around us. The air was cool, but it didn't feel fresh. It felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky was clear. We didn't speak much during the walk. Daniel was absorbed in the view, occasionally commenting on the scenery, but I barely registered his words. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of thoughts I couldn't escape. Richard. The kiss. The guilt. The fear of what was coming. "I've been thinking about this trip," Daniel said eventually, his voice quiet. "I know things have been off lately. But I think we're making the right choice. We need this, don't you think?" I looked at him, trying to focus on his face, but all I could see was the distance between us. The more he spoke, the more I felt like a stranger to him. How had we gotten here? How had we become so disconnected? "I think we do need this," I said quietly, not sure if I was telling him the truth or just going through the motions. "But I'm not sure it's going to fix everything." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face me. His eyes searched mine, as if he were trying to understand what was going on behind my distant expression. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain that I was no longer sure who I was, or who we were. That this trip, this attempt to fix things, felt like it was too little, too late. "I don't know," I said finally. I just don't know anymore." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else. But instead, he just nodded, his face unreadable. I couldn't tell if he understood or if he was just choosing to let it go, choosing not to confront whatever was happening between us. After a few more moments of silence, we continued walking, side by side, but the distance between us seemed wider than ever. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending. And as the conversation with Richard loomed closer, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't hide from the truth forever. The next morning, the quiet of the cabin felt oppressive, almost suffocating. The sun had risen lazily over the lake, its light creeping through the window in pale golden beams that should have been comforting but instead felt intrusive. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Daniel moving around in the other room. The silence between us was louder than ever. I was acutely aware of the weight of the truth pressing against my chest, but I didn't know how to speak it. How could I explain what was happening inside me, when I wasn't even sure of it myself? Daniel seemed oblivious to the inner turmoil I was experiencing. He went about his morning routine, showering, dressing, making coffee, as though everything was perfectly normal. I envied him for that. I wished I could simply go through the motions without the burden of this guilt, this overwhelming sense of inevitability. But I couldn't. Every part of me was on edge, constantly alert, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment when I would have to face the consequences of my actions. I got out of bed and moved quietly through the cabin, hoping to find some kind of solace in the familiar surroundings. But nothing felt familiar anymore. The cabin, the lake, the trees, they all seemed distant now, like a world I no longer belonged to. I wandered outside to the porch, hoping the fresh air might clear my mind, but it only made everything feel sharper. The birds, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, the distant ripples of the water, all of it felt like noise, overwhelming and inescapable. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but all I could see was Richard's face, his words, the way everything had shifted between us. I had made a decision when I agreed to meet him yesterday. A decision to face the truth, to confront the reality of what was happening. But now that the moment had come, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken, or if it was even possible to fix it. After a while, Daniel joined me on the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee. He sat beside me, his movements slow, almost tentative, as if he could sense the tension hanging in the air. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice cautious. I nodded, but I knew I wasn't convincing. He didn't say anything else, just sipped his coffee and stared out at the lake. I wanted to tell him everything, to finally speak the truth, but the words felt stuck in my throat. How could I tell him what had happened? How could I explain the feelings I had been hiding, the mistakes I had made? "I'm sorry," I said after a long silence. I don't know what's going on with me." Daniel looked at me, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I don't feel like myself anymore. I don't know who I am, or what I want. I've been so caught up in trying to make everything okay, that I've lost myself. He placed his cup down on the table, his gaze steady as he watched me. There was a sadness in his eyes, but no anger. He wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding answers. He was just waiting. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said quietly. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so focused on my own turmoil, on my own confusion, that I hadn't stopped to consider how all of this was affecting him. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered. "But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what's happening to me." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was palpable, like an invisible wall had been erected between us, one that neither of us knew how to tear down. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing on me, the knowledge that everything was about to change, whether I was ready for it or not. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I said, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm trapped, like I'm suffocating, and I don't know how to get out." Daniel reached out then, his hand resting gently on mine. His touch was warm, but it didn't bring the comfort I had hoped for. It only reminded me of how much we had lost, how much had changed. "You're not trapped," he said softly. But I can't help you if you don't let me in. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could somehow fix everything, that we could go back to the way things were before. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and there was no going back. I don't know if I can let you in, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can trust myself. The silence stretched between us again, heavy and thick. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. I was too afraid of what I might see there, disappointment, hurt, maybe even betrayal. I had already let him down so many times, and now, I was about to shatter everything we had left. I don't want to lose you, Daniel repeated, his voice stronger this time, as if he were trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep us from slipping away. But I couldn't promise him that. I couldn't promise him anything when I wasn't sure what was happening inside me, when I didn't even know who I was anymore. I need some time, I said, finally looking at him. I need to figure this out. He nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need. I just want you to be honest with me, with yourself. I will, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. We sat there for a while longer, neither of us knowing what to say, both of us trying to make sense of the mess we had found ourselves in. I could feel the uncertainty swirling around us, the unspoken truth hanging between us like a cloud. Finally, Daniel stood up, stretching his arms above his head. I'm going to take a walk. I'll leave you to think. I nodded, watching him as he walked away, his figure slowly disappearing into the trees. I sat on the porch for a long time after he left, the silence surrounding me like a thick blanket. My mind was racing, but there were no answers, only more questions. What was I supposed to do? Where did I go from here? I didn't know. But as the day wore on, I knew one thing for sure, things were never going to be the same. The path ahead was unclear, but I had already stepped onto it. Now, I had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if I didn't know where it would lead. The morning after Daniel went for his walk, everything felt eerily still. The cabin was quiet, the only sound being the soft rustling of the trees outside and the occasional distant bird call. It was as if time had slowed, allowing me to fully absorb the weight of the decisions I had made and the chaos I had set in motion. I hadn't heard from Richard after our last conversation, and part of me was relieved. I needed time to think, to gather my thoughts before anything else happened. But the silence also made me uneasy. What was going on in his mind? What was going on in mine? I sat by the window, watching the lake below. The water was calm, the morning mist slowly lifting, revealing the stillness beneath. It should have been peaceful, but all I could feel was a gnawing sense of dread. The beauty of the moment only made the tension more apparent. My heart raced at the thought of what was coming, of what I was avoiding. It was strange, this trip was meant to bring us closer, to reconnect. But instead, it had become a reminder of how far apart Daniel and I had drifted. Every glance, every unspoken word between us seemed to reinforce the distance that now existed between us. I felt like a stranger to him, and he felt like a stranger to me. We were still physically here, sharing the same space, but emotionally, we were miles apart. Daniel came back from his walk just as I finished my coffee. He entered the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't speak right away, just dropped his bag near the door and took off his jacket. He looked exhausted, though he hadn't done much more than take a walk around the lake. It wasn't physical exhaustion, but something deeper, something that had settled in him just as it had settled in me. I went up to the ridge, he said finally, his voice quiet. I needed some air. I nodded, not sure how to respond. I could feel his eyes on me, though I didn't look at him. He was waiting for something, some sort of acknowledgement, but I didn't know what to give him. I've been thinking too, I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. About everything. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the small kitchen area, poured himself a glass of water, and took a long drink. I noticed the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he set the glass down. "We can't keep going like this, can we?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of unspoken things. I stood up slowly, the words I had been avoiding bubbling to the surface. "No," I replied, my voice barely audible. "We can't." The silence between us felt like a physical thing. It pressed in on me, suffocating me. Every word felt like a betrayal, every thought too dangerous to voice. But we couldn't keep pretending. We couldn't keep living in a lie, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. "I don't know how we got here," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know when it all started slipping away." I looked at him, the man I had spent so many years with. But right now, he seemed like a stranger. A stranger I had to face the truth with. And the truth was a cold, hard thing that none of us could escape. "I don't know either," I said quietly. "But I feel lost. I feel like I've been pretending for too long, like I've been trying to hold something together that's already broken." His expression softened, and for a brief moment, I saw the man I had married, the man who once made me feel safe, the man who once made me feel like I mattered. But that man was slipping away, and in his place was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had hurt me without meaning to, and someone who was slowly being hurt by the choices I had made. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted us to fall apart." "I never wanted it either," I whispered, tears threatening to rise in my throat. "But somewhere along the way, we did." The words hung in the air, unspoken and yet so painfully clear. We had fallen apart, quietly, without realizing it, until it was too late. We stood there for what felt like hours, the distance between us growing even wider. I wanted to reach out, to make him understand, but I didn't know how. How could I explain that I was no longer the person he married? How could I explain that I wasn't sure who I was anymore, let alone who we were together? I think I need to go home," I said finally, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I think I need some time." Daniel didn't say anything. He just nodded, the look in his eyes unreadable. I turned to walk toward the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't keep pretending. I had to face the consequences of what I had done, and I had to do it alone. I didn't know how long I stood in the bedroom, packing my things, but it felt like an eternity. I moved slowly, mechanically, as though I were moving through someone else's life. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing, that I needed time to figure things out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running away from something I had no control over. As I zipped up my bag, I turned to look at the empty bed. The bed we had shared for years, now a symbol of everything we had lost. My chest ached, and I realized just how deeply I had hurt him, just how much I had let everything slip away. I wasn't ready to face the truth, not fully. But I had to. I had to face what I had done and what it meant for my marriage, for myself. I stepped out of the room, bag in hand, and walked toward the door. Daniel was sitting on the porch, staring out at the lake. His posture was slumped, defeated. He didn't look up as I passed him. I stopped in the doorway for a moment, watching him, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't say goodbye. Not like this. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible, before stepping outside and closing the door behind me. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. I couldn't. I drove away from the cabin, from the lake, from Daniel. I drove into the unknown, not sure where I was going or what I would find when I got there. I just knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in the silence any longer. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and uncertain. And as I drove, I realized one thing: no matter where I went, I would have to confront the truth eventually. There was